Hi, everyone. I am joined today with Emileigh Barnes, who's a content strategist, among other things, at Capital One. And she's going to talk with us today about content and design. Welcome, Emileigh.
Hi, I'm glad to be here.
So please, if I did not introduce you correctly, let you please edit that. But yeah, so tell us what you do at Capital One, among other things.
Yeah, so these days I'm a senior design manager, which means that I lead design teams, and the space that I work on are Capital One cafes. So those are hybrid spaces where people from the community, it doesn't just have to be Capital One customers, they can come in and get financial help planning, planning their future, go to classes and workshops. They can take care of banking needs. They can also just get a cup of coffee. They all have Pete's coffee shops in them and their co-working spaces. So they're like really interesting kind of hybrid places where people can do all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
It's awesome. Yeah, I've actually visited one in Lincoln Park here in Chicago. That was really
Oh, yeah.
nice. So,
Yep.
very
There are
cool.
two in Chicago, one in Lincoln Park, one in Southport, I think. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Okay. Yeah, I know where that's at. So yes, I know that you are a writer, a poet. We talked to just earlier. So please tell me about your other experience, your other background, and sort of how that, yeah, what you've been doing in your career, and then we'll dig into some of the details.
Yeah. I started college thinking I'd grow up to be a journalist. And then I graduated in 2008, right when the financial crisis took out all of those wonderful newspapers, and decided that that wasn't a career path for me. And then decided to go into a field that is even more unstable than journalism and got my MFA in poetry. When I was finished with that, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do or who I wanted to be. So I took a job in the government because that felt like a stable place to work. And I was doing technical writing. I was, writing policy. I was writing trainings, and it was fine. I didn't feel particularly passionate about it. And then an opportunity opened up when Barack Obama started founding some digital service teams after the healthcare.gov failure. There were a bunch of teams working with government agencies to improve technology, to transform kind of the digital government experience. And I joined one of those. I wasn't sure exactly what I would do or what it would mean. I just knew that they had a lot of content that they needed to think about and make better for people. And I was a writer, and they were like, you know what? Come on, join us. We'll figure it out together.
That's really cool.
Yeah. I do think content strategy was a field at that time. And there were people who had it more figured out than I did. I just kind of learned it on the fly as
Oh,
part of
very
the job.
interesting. Yeah. Did you have any interest or knowledge of like the UX field or like product design?
I didn't. I did a lot of it naturally, and I think a lot of UX and UI designers and content strategists and design strategists, everyone feels this way. I was kind of naturally doing a lot of those design thinking skills without knowing what they were and what to call them.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So, I read somewhere, and maybe you can explain this because I thought it was interesting, is I think in one of your talks, Emileigh gives great talks, so you should search her online and watch some of hers. That's how I found you. I heard you speaking at a conference, and I just thought it was fantastic. But it was, I think, someone labeled you as a content designer, and I thought that was just a cool name. I feel like I understand it, but I'd love if you can explain it a little bit.
Yeah, there is an interesting split in the content world of what people like to be called and why. So some people like to be called content strategists, some people like to be called content designers, some people like to be called something else entirely. I called myself a content designer for a long time because I worked in a really design forward organization. So design led, design was in charge of shaping the intent of projects. They were in charge of managing projects. And I wanted to position myself as a designer because I felt like what I did was really designing just with words. And there's no just about that at all. Words are really important, but it was helping shape websites and digital tools from the standpoint of words, which is a very design-y task. Now, when I shifted to Capital One, I started calling myself a content strategist, kind of for the same reason that I felt strategy was really the thing that was positioned better in our organization and the group that I wanted to be aligned to there. Because a lot of what designers do is very strategic. And in that moment, strategy felt like the right thing to call myself. I was a content strategist. I helped shape the strategy of projects and the direction they took. So yeah, I've called myself different things different times based on like what felt most relevant to the people I was working with and, you know, what would help them understand what I did and who I was.
I
Yeah,
think it's really interesting. And it is a smart way to think about how others perceive you. If you're in a design organization compared to like a large corporation where strategy is much more commonly understood, at least over a
right.
designer, I guess.
Design. And yeah, I had this really great boss, Aradna, who told me once, don't get too stuck on the title that you have. Think about who you are as a person and what value you bring to organizations, and then do that. And don't worry about what people call you. Call yourself whatever gives you what you need at the
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
I love that. That's great. I would love to spend a little bit of time talking about your thoughts on content first design. Maybe explain a little bit about what that is and how it is effective.
Totally. Um, you know, you can explain it really simply. Content first design is you decide the content before you decide the design, right? And I think the simplest way to make a case for it is you just have to know what you want to say first before you decide how to say it. So you can't say, oh, I know my book should have an orange cover until you know what your book is about. And it's the same for a website, right? You can't say, oh, we're going to put a big picture, a big hero image because that's what's trendy right now. Well, I mean, maybe that works, but maybe it doesn't work too. You have to know what it is that you want to convey to people first, and then everything else falls around it. And that's the basic idea of content first design.
I love that. So I'm curious with your current group, um, is there different processes for creating a new product versus enhancing an existing one?
Oh my
So,
God. I
yeah,
mean,
okay.
yes. And there are different processes depending on like which team you're on too. So it's
Okay.
like, what are you doing? Which team are you working on? Who are you collaborating with? And then like the process could be any manner of things. Yeah.
Okay. So that, yeah, that's something that I feel like if you're new to design, you might not understand you might not understand that. I mean, your process for designing something probably changes per project too, you know?
Yeah, 100%. And that can feel really scary because if you are a trained designer, you kind of learn a process and you're taught like this is the process to do things and this is the most rigorous and the correct way to do it. The real world just isn't like that. And, you know, I've mostly only worked in really big matrixed organizations like the US government or like a giant bank. And like the reality is like on any team, you're working with real people and, you know, you'll beat your head against a wall forever if all you can say is this isn't the most rigorous way to do stuff. We have to do things in this order. What you have to find out is like what people care about and make things as good as possible in the constraints that you're working in, which is actually the definition of design, right? It's making something in constraints. So the constraints are just always changing.
I love that. That's a great kind of quote. I think that's awesome. Okay. I'm curious if you can talk about your process sort of for a specific project, possibly from the past or something you talk about where you worked from like sort of the ideation phase into like design.
Yeah, so I worked on a redesign for our Capital One Cafe's website, and there was an existing website that was out there, and it was structured. It just grew organically over time, is the thing to say. And it started because we had a cafe, and we were like, oh, we have a cafe. This is great. Let's make a website for that cafe so people can find out information. And then we had 5 cafes, so suddenly we had 5 pages, and then we had 25 cafes. And so we had 25 pages, but then we were like, oh, let's make some kind of regional pages to sit on top of those 25 pages. So if you're in Boston, you can go to like the Boston page, but then down to one of the like individual Boston cafe pages. And then we had a national page to go on top of the market pages when we felt like we were a nationwide company. But the structure just existed because that's the way the cafes existed. It didn't exist that way because that's the way people thought of cafes, right?
Yeah.
And one day we sat down and we had a second to breathe. We just hadn't even had a minute to elevate out of what we were doing and look at what we had made. And we said, wow, what we've made is actually really a mess. And people don't understand it at all. They can't navigate through the site. They get stuck in these weird dead ends. They can't figure out where else they might go. And so we just basically started from scratch, and we did use content first design. And the way that we did that is we started by interviewing a bunch of customers and non-customers and talking to them about our cafes and figuring out what was interesting to them and how they thought about what existed there. So a common thing that you'll see with organizations is that they will organize their website by their lines of business. So like at Capital One, if we have checking accounts, we might have a checking section. If we have savings accounts, we might have a savings section of our website. And that's because we have a checking team, we have a savings team, we have a credit card team. That's often not the way people think about information.
Yeah.
And that's why starting with content first can be really valuable. So what we figured out was, rather than the way our cafe teams were structured, how people thought about our cafes and what was important to them. And we discovered that people think of, all the events that are happening in a cafe, no matter what team they're coming from, those are all events. And if we're interested in events, we'd like to find out about events. So we organized all of our content then the way that people thought about it. And we built the website around that.
That's so interesting. It's a very common problem. I'm sure a lot of people who do kind of what we do fall into, where you start somewhere, then you have to add one thing and you have to add another. And a few months later, you realize you just added tons of stuff and now you're confused. So I'm glad. I think it's so interesting that you did that.
It's also really hard to tell teams like, we're going to stop moving forward and instead revisit what we've done so far, because it feels like a step back to people.
Yeah.
It's also really hard to organize things the way that users think about it rather than the way that companies think about it, because usually that means that teams that don't communicate, that live in silos, have to work together, and that can be really scary and hard. So back when I worked for the government, I worked on the digital transformation for the Federal Election Commission, which is the group that tracks how all money is raised and spent in federal elections. So if you wanted to look up, who donated to Hillary Clinton or how much money she raised, like that is the organization that knows the answer to that. Wow. And they have been doing open data since they were founded in the 70s, which means that their website was a really early government website, which also means that it is pretty outdated when we got to it. And the way their content was organized was based on form. So if you wanted to know how much money Hillary raised, you needed to know which form that got reported onto the FEC, and they all had like numbers and nobody understood how to find that information. So even though the website content was organized in a way that completely made sense to the organization, it was okay, all of the like Form C information is on the Form C section. There was no way to find out the information in a way that humans understood it, which was, what is Hillary Clinton doing? So when we approached that website, we've turned all the data into an API. That was the most important thing, right? So we could access it in different ways at different times, but we organized the content around the way people understood the content, right? So you could find things based on the candidate you were looking for or the person who donated that you wanted to find out what information they were doing. And by starting with the content rather than the organization, or rather than our assumptions about what the content should be, it made the website something that people could actually use.
That is so interesting. I love it, and it's something I feel like we when you design towards user expectations, I feel like sometimes it's called like design towards a mental model, which is like a buzzword in UX.
Yeah.
It's good for non-designers to know that word. Mental model just means designing towards how people would naturally expect something to work. And obviously, it's really impactful.
Yeah, and you bring up a great point because sometimes people resist content first design because they're like, I'm not a content person, but I'm a great UX designer. I know how to do UX. There's so much overlap between the two that if you do content first design, you are still working closely. It's not like the content person is doing the design, right? And our team, it was, we had a tech person working really closely with a UX person, working really closely with a researcher, really working really closely with me as a content person. And it was only the combination of all of us together that could accomplish the website the way we needed to accomplish it.
Yeah, that is interesting. I wish I had some prepared questions about it, but it is interesting when you work in a very large organization, and it's actually something that the talk I saw you give touches on is communicating amongst these silos in these really, I don't know, I would say like more old school type organizations, like big corporations that aren't used to having to work together with people.
Yeah.
Maybe do you want to touch on some light tips on how to do that,
Um,
manage with that?
yeah, absolutely. You know, there's a lot that you can do that's really important. The first thing, and I think it goes back to this, like, who are you rather than knowing your job title. The first thing for being known in an organization is knowing who you are, right? So, like, what do you stand for? What do you care about? And then you make sure that you true back to that all the time. And then the second thing is that you just have to connect with people, and that can be hard to do, and it can feel hard to do if you don't feel like you have a reason to reach out to someone who doesn't work in your organization. The way that I usually try to approach that is I do it first just as a person rather than as like a business person. I'll like ask someone for coffee and get to know what they care about and what their background is. And then second, I start to think about how we can collaborate and what we might have a shared interest in and want to work on together.
I love that. Yeah, if you think about it, it's a very human approach. It's a designer approach where you're just trying to get to know people and you're all trying to align on the same goals. I like
Yeah,
that.
exactly. It's applying the tools we use as designers to the relationships we have. Yeah, so you empathize with people first,
Yeah,
and then everything else builds off of that.
very interesting. I would love to talk to you a bit about sort of the design phase because I'm sure now you've have gone through it many times where you've worked on writing, content planning, possibly IA type stuff, which you talked about. And then as a writer, do you feel comfortable in like the visual design phase? Anywhere from like wireframing onward.
Yeah, I don't do it myself, but I have gotten a lot more comfortable critiquing it and learning about it and understanding it. And I think this is true for any leader. You're going to have probably one area of expertise where you feel really confident, and then you'll have people underneath you who do everything else. And you have to figure out, how do I make myself valuable to the team when they're in phases that aren't like my deepest area of expertise.
Oh,
Um,
that's interesting.
yeah, and I found that this is sometimes the reason why leaders resist other disciplines that aren't their own. Like sometimes they resist having a design strategist paired to their team because that's not what they do, or a content strategist because that's not what they do. But really, when you surround yourself with people whose skills are wider than your own, like you can see the amazing like breadth and depth that you can accomplish with design work. But to your original question, like what do I do when we're in a visual phase and I'm not a visual designer? Um, One, I try to know as much about visual design as I can so that I can understand, some basic stuff. But I also just ask for help and get us like critique throughout our organization. So we have a lot of critique processes set up with experts in different fields in our teams. And I think that's something that anyone could stand up in their own org. You could set up like, oh, we have a content hour where our best content folks will critique whatever your team is working on for you.
I love that.
Yeah, I get people to help me when I feel
Yeah.
like I can't do it myself.
I think that's great. That's something that everyone should take away is also opening up your work to other people or opening up your services to other people's work is a great way to get to know people and build trust and friendships and make better work.
And there's this interesting thing in friendships that is studied that, like, if you want to be friends with someone, you want to become friends with someone, if you ask for help, it works better than if you offer help. So if you were like, it's counterintuitive, but if you were like, hey, I'm moving in, can you help me move into my apartment? People are more likely to become friends with you after doing that than if you offer to help them with something.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and I think it applies to organizations too. So asking for help is great. People feel useful, they feel valuable, they've provided something to your team that you need.
That's awesome. Yeah, I wonder if there's a feeling vulnerable in asking someone, another person can sense that, and that maybe you become more. That person sees you differently. I don't know.
Totally. I mean,
I totally edit that out. I can't talk.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you can just be a human, right? People will be a human back to you. Mostly. Some people are jerks, and they're just always be jerks in general. My mom has this wonderful pearl of wisdom, and she's full of these, but anytime I was having trouble with a relationship growing up, she would be like, you need to spend time with them. And I'd be like, I don't want to spend time with them, we're fighting. And she'd be like, the only way that you have a relationship with someone is by having shared experiences with someone. And I think about that all the time at work. If a relationship feels rocky, I'm like, when was the last time we spent time together? When was the last time we did something together? And a lot of the times we haven't had a shared experience in a little while. And that is the foundation of all relationships, professional and personal.
Yeah. So that's great. That's really good. Good one.
Thanks, Mom.
I'm going to use that. That's smart. Thank you. I feel like I've definitely learned even more than I was expecting. So I want to focus a little bit on something that you're probably not as familiar with, which is wireframes. Okay. And it's because Balsamiq makes software that makes wireframes.
Yes, I've used Balsamiq before.
I love that. Okay, maybe tell me a little bit about that. As a non-designer, as a writer, you're using Balsamiq. Tell me more.
Yeah. And I think that content designers are actually great in the wireframing phase because we're thinking about what information should be on the page and what that hierarchical importance is. So sure, we're not trained in the rule of thirds or I don't know, I'm not trained in it, so I can't give you good examples of what I'm not trained in, but we do a really good job of thinking of how to structure information because that is what content does all day long, and wireframes really are just structuring information. I have used Balsamiq a lot in projects where we're trying to go wide. So we're trying to come up with what could a lot of options for what this looks like be. And it's been really useful in that sense for those types of things. Because you're like, okay, well, we could lead with this piece of information that feels really important. Or what if we led with this information instead? What if we restructured things so we had only 3 things on the homepage that we thought were really critical to our users versus what if we had 8? I think that wireframing works just as well if you're thinking about it as a way of organizing content as if you're thinking about it as where should we put a picture box.
Yeah, that's very perfectly well said again. It's something that I want to get out there more. And one of the things I wanted to say too is what I love about working with writers as a more visual designer is a writer will understand how people will perceive the words much better than someone who's more visual instead of a writer. So I think wireframes, in my experience, just like you said, they will work on the impact of the words and where they go and how much should be on there. And I think Balsamiq, I'm biased, I guess, but I think wireframing, but Balsamiq helps. But wireframing in general is a great way to sort of explore that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one reason to have content involved, even from the earliest stages, whether or not we're the ones making wireframes or we're collaborating with a UX designer to make wireframes, is there are just assumptions that people will make about content that a content person can help you dispense with. Like, I can remember working on a website and someone was like, "Well, what should we put on the caption for this photo?" And I was like, "Well, why do we need a caption?" And they're like, "Photos have captions." And I was like, "They don't have to." But if you don't have a content person there, you are just assuming that there should be content in places where maybe there shouldn't.
Yeah, that's amazing. Love it. It's such a what I love about um, talking with you is like I feel like there's tons of parallels with working with the designer as a writer and working with a writer as a designer. I think it's great.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. I mean, vice versa. I've had the same thing said to me where I was like, well, let's, like put an image here. And they were like, well, why? We don't have to have an image. We don't have to have an image. Or like, I learn things all the time. I'll be like, oh, we're going to put a button at the bottom of the page. And someone's like, or, did you consider we could do XYZ thing and not have to have the user make a choice at all? And I was like, great. That's awesome.
I
Yeah.
love it. That's great. Yeah, totally. Collaboration. Well, that's kind of it for my questions. I guess, no, I guess I have one more because this is something that I've found you don't learn until you do. But is once your design, your project is released into the world, what happens next for you?
Mm.
Do you continue to maintain it, and what does that look like?
Well, hopefully you release it before the last time you release it is the thing. Um, my good friend Jeremy Canfield, who I worked with at 18F in the government, always said, if you're not a little embarrassed when you release, you waited too long to release. Uh, So hopefully you're still working on it when you release it. Hopefully you release something small, you make it better, you make it better, you make it better. Now, a website is great and ready to be maintained when no one tells you anything about the website anymore, when everyone forgets about it, when the design and the content just disappear and people are using it, right? There's never a phase where people are like, wow, this website is awesome. Thanks for creating it. There's only a period where people are like, this doesn't work like I expected. This is the worst thing that's ever happened. And then there's a period where there's nothing. And the period where there's nothing is when you're like, great, we can start like maintaining this or thinking about adding new features or, move on to something else. Since I like to live in the strategy world, I'm often at the beginnings of projects and not so often at the ends of projects, which I miss very much because there's something deeply gratifying about being at the end of a project or in the governance phase. And that phase is really, really important.
That's great. I love it. Well, that's kind of all the questions I have. I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add or.
Um, no, I don't think so.
Perfect.
Thank you for taking the time. It was
Yeah.
great to chat with you.
Well, thank you.